am the I am the chairperson for the Graduate Library Committee here at Howard University. And really our goal, our reason to be is to be able to be the liaison between the graduate students and our university library system. So we invite people like Paolo, who we'll be meeting shortly, to really be able to assist our graduate students in their research endeavors. So we also have Mr. Waters here with us, our graduate librarian. Mr. Waters, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Yeah, pretty much. I hope that this workshop is very beneficial for everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And so Paulo, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce yourself briefly, and we'll dive right in.
Thank you, Ben. So, hello, everyone. I'm Paolo Guijide. I'm the strategist for the ORCID US Community. So, the ORCID US Community is a consortium of ORCID US, basically ORCID member organizations in the US, and Howard University is one of our members.
Sounds great. Welcome.
All right, shall we start the session, the workshop?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. And since there's not that many of us here, feel free to jump in if you have any questions along the way. Um, you know, any clarifications that you would like to know more about, just feel free to say something.
Sounds good.
All right, hopefully y'all can see my screen now.
It's working on it. Oh, there it goes. There it goes.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. So I mentioned that the ORCID US community, basically the ORCID US community is part of Lyrasis. So our administrative home is Lyrasis, and from the library folks, you all are probably familiar with Lyrasis. It's more of like a library consortium where we work with different libraries to bring them content, for example, databases, all of those things. And one of those offerings is ORCID. And today we're just going to talk about ORCID in general. So it's a workshop for researchers, to you all, and anybody else that are kind of working in academia, especially, or would like to have this kind of robust information in their ORCID record. All right, so just a quick agenda. So we're just going to briefly talk about what is ORCID. We're also going to discuss the benefits of ORCID. If you have not have or you don't have an ORCID ID, we're also going to go through sort of just like a workflow or steps in getting your ORCID ID. And then we'll also talk about how to populate your ORCID record. It's always important that you're populating your ORCID record. You know, you could have an ORCID ID, but if it's empty, it doesn't really make sense. So we're going to go through that. And of course, we'll have more questions and discussions in the end. But again, feel free to just kind of say something if you have any questions along the way. All right, so why don't we kind of just start? I'm kind of curious if you all or you have an ORCID ID or whether you don't have one. Feel free to jump in, say something on chat, all of those things.
I signed up for ORCID ID last year, Paolo.
Wonderful. Anyone else?
I don't have one.
Gloria, did you say you have one or you don't have one?
I don't have an ORCID ID.
Okay, okay, great. So we'll definitely walk through that process today. Yeah, so anyone else perhaps? Okay. Okay. Well, it's good that that you have, Ben, that you have an ORCID ID. Gloria, definitely that's one thing that we're gonna go through today to just kind of see how you can get that ORCID ID and work for doing that process of getting an ORCID ID, populating your ORCID ID, and of course, why it is important for you all to have one.
Hey, Paolo, I think we have two responses in the chat, one from
Oh,
Andrea and one from Kevin as well.
wonderful. Great, thank you. Let me actually, so I can see the chat here. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing, y'all. I think this is valuable information to have, especially when we're talking about ORCID today. Um, Great. And I will also um, share a PDF copy of this slide deck to Tommy, so you all can basically have a copy of this slide deck as well after the session. All right, so let's talk about what is ORCID. So ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. So the key part here is that it is open, so freely available to everyone. But also we want to make sure that you are thinking about that it's researchers and contributors. So it's not necessarily that you have to be a researcher, but it could be anyone really that's part of that process of research, or it could just be part of in that kind of the world of the entire ecosystem of scholarly communication, for example, even publishers, students, all of those people are basically are contributors in this field. And it's been probably just a little bit over 10 years now since the start of ORCID. So it's definitely steadily growing. More and more folks are aware of it now. I remember about, in around 2015 when it's just kind of really starting to get a hold of like what ORCID is, especially in libraries when I used to be an academic librarian at universities. So that's kind of, at that time, I probably just have sort of a very minimal knowledge of what ORCID is. And that's always something that we kind of share with faculty, for example, employees at the university, just giving everyone information. But ORCID is really, it's an open researcher and contributor identifier, but most people will just call it ORCID. And it's probably now it's being used across the world. We currently have about over 9 million active users. So there's definitely from pretty much every part of the world, there's an ORCID user that's that's basically part there. All right, so this is an ORCID ID. Like I said, ORCID is free for you all. So you can sign up for one. It should not cost you money to sign up. Um, so for researchers, for contributors, you can get your ORCID ID for free easily. And this is sort of like our volunteer researcher here, Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, and you will see that at the bottom, you'll see an ORCID ID. So really what you're probably familiar with is that set of numbers there towards the end. That's the ORCID ID. However, we do want to emphasize that really an ORCID identifier or ORCID ID itself is that entire thing that includes that HTTPS part. So it's sort of like a URL because it is a URL. So if you're sharing this with folks, for example, sharing this or adding this to your email signature, I actually add my ORCID ID on my email signature, for example. So people can actually click on that link and it will take them to what we are calling an ORCID record. So an ORCID record itself is sort of like an online CV. So this is where you can find information about your activities. So what here you'll see like the biography of Sophia, for example. So you can add that. You will see the ORCID ID here. Um, One thing to kind of remember that the ORCID ID is a unique identifier as well. So you can kind of think of it as like a social security number, for example. It identifies that person. So that's really kind of what ORCID ID is here. And then you have additional information about email addresses, for example, if you have it publicly available. You have websites, all of those things. But one of the things that you're going to see here is that employment portion, for example. So it's really is kind of like an online CV. So you have employment information. You will also have education and qualifications. So where did this person got their degree from? So you can add that information in your ORCID record. You will also have professional activities. Now, professional activities is basically kind of different things here. So you will see, for example, membership. So if you're a member of an organization, an association, for example, in your field of studies, you can add that information here. There's also service. So if you are a committee member, so a committee member for example, um, the the library advisory board, for example, for graduate students or something like that, right? So you can add that information here. You also have information about distinction. So you can add distinctions, awards that you received, for example. And then invited positions. So if you're a position that basically at a university or something like that, you can add that information in your professional activities as well. Now, if you scroll down more in your ORCID record, you will also see information about funding. So funding that you've received from, say, NIH, American Heart Association, all of those things. There's also what we are calling research resources. Now, research resources here, I primarily, you can think of it sort of like laboratory equipment. It could be like a special and rare collection books or set of books, for example. So organizations, if they have an ORCID integration or if they have the capability of writing to ORCID, they can write that information in somebody's ORCID record. So it would be like this researcher, for example, used the giant laser kind of equipment in their national laboratory. Or this researcher or this graduate student used this archival images of glaciers in our library or in our archives. So that kind of information, those are sort of like the research resources. And the other thing also down below, you will see that category of works. So works here are pretty much the products that you have produced, right? As a researcher, as a contributor. So it could be like your publications. It could also be it could be artwork if you wanted to, so you can add that information here. So those are products or works in ORCID. You will also have, and publishers have this ability if they are connecting to ORCID with an integration, the publishers are able to write peer review activities. So if you are a peer reviewer for a journal, for example, and that publisher is pushing that information to somebody's ORCID record, they could say like, so and so is a peer reviewer of this journal. So that's a really good way to kind of show to the world that that you are involved in this journal or that you're involved in this kind of field of studies and that you are peer reviewing this journals. It's not going to say which article you reviewed, but it will say the journal that you were reviewed, which is the most important thing. And I think you don't want the articles to be shown anyways, because the peer review activities are usually blind reviews. All right, so I'm going to pause there for now. Are there any questions so far?
Not for me.
Yeah, I don't have anything.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now we just kind of did a really brief overview of what ORCID is, looking at an ORCID ID and looking at an ORCID record. Basically, those are the things that are the researchers are probably most familiar with, the contributors, the ORCID users are familiar with. Now, let's kind of focus a little bit on why ORCID is important. So the benefits of ORCID for you, for example. All right. So first things first, ORCID ID distinguishes you, right? Because it is a unique identifier. It identifies you. It also persists over time. So when we think about persisting over time, is that your ORCID ID is really your ORCID ID pretty much throughout your lifetime. It's not going to get assigned to somebody else. What you've created, your ORCID ID, that's basically you, and that's your ORCID ID, and it persists. You will probably hear this in other kind of information or articles that you will see anywhere, or maybe even when you're looking at potentially federal funding or policies that they will talk about digital persistent identifier or persistent identifiers. So that's basically the idea of persistence. It's going to be the same throughout the entire time. And ORCID is a persistent identifier for individuals, so for researchers. And another example of persistent identifier, and you're probably most familiar with, is the DOI, so the digital object identifier. So that's a persistent identifier because that's going to identify the article, for example. Now, ORCID also can bolster your digital identity. So it's really gonna, like what your digital presence is. So that's really a big part of ORCID. It will also ensure that you meet requirements. So funder, for example, you're applying for a funding from this funding agency, for this from this private funder, making sure that you are meeting those requirements. Also from publishers, sometimes publisher will ask for your ORCID ID, and perhaps your organization or your institution will also require you to have an ORCID ID for reporting purposes. So that would be grabbing information about your works, for example. And ultimately, ORCID is really about saving you time. And then we'll talk more about this and how ORCID saves you time. But that's a big part of it. Saving your time when you're filling out forms, saving the time when you're logging into different systems, all of those things is really a big part of that. So it's saving you time, but it also saving your organization's time, the administrators, because they don't have to collect a lot of things because all the information that they probably need is already available in your ORCID ID. All right, so let's kind of dig a little bit deeper through these benefits. All right. All right, so this is always a good example, right? Distinguishing yourself. Kind of, feel free to jump in. Like, how many of you have maybe another person, another researcher have the same name as you, and they get you confused with that somebody else, with that other person? I know I've heard stories about this where, so and so have pretty much the same name. Um, and that's really a big part of this is it distinguishes you because it's unique. It identifies you. This is a good example here from PubMed, an article basically. So we can kind of see right here, we have so many authors or researchers with the same last name and perhaps even the same initials. So we don't really know who these researchers are, which is which ones are we talking about? So having that ORCID ID distinguishes one from the other person, and that's a good thing. It also distinguishes you over time. So if you change your name or if you've used different variations of their name, I've used different variations of my name, for example. Like sometimes I will use just my initial and then my last name, or it could just be Paolo Guijide. Sometimes I will include my middle name or my middle initial in my articles or any works that I've done. So having an ORCID ID, it really kind of persists that over time, and it's making sure that it's you with the different variations of the name, and it's still you as that person, as a researcher. And we talk about this, bolstering your digital identity. So again, you will see an example here of an article. You will see like there's a link to somebody's ORCID ID, right? You'll see that green kind of icon that says ID. You can click on that and that will take you to their ORCID record. So it's already kind of bringing you back to their ORCID record, letting everyone know what they've done, where they've worked at, their education, all of those things. And data in ORCID, the ORCID ID and the ORCID record is really meant to be shared and reused. We'll do more and we'll talk more about this in details, but that will help you filling out forms, for example. It will also make researchers kind of find each other and make connections. And that's always important in the field as well. And of course, a big part of this is getting the recognition for your work. So making sure that you get the credit for the works that you've done, making sure that that this article is basically credited and recognized for you. And this one, talking about just meeting requirements. Many of the funders now are requiring or asking investigators for their ORCID ID. We've probably seen this a lot in the health sciences or in the STEM area. So these are just some examples and some of our members here that are requiring ORCID IDs when you're applying for grants or when you're applying for funding in their organization. So American Heart Association, for example, Melanoma Research Alliance. So these are just some of the organizations that are requiring ORCID ID. And of course, the federal government, federal agencies are also now starting to really look into ORCID and making sure that investigators have ORCID ID. One of the biggest thing that's gonna kind of gonna make an impact next year, especially starting May 25th, 2025, is that when you're applying for an NIH funding, for example, they will ask for your persistent identifier, which is basically asking the persistent identifier for the senior and key personnel. So you're talking about a persistent identifier for investigators or individuals, and really ORCID is what they're looking for here. So they want you to have an ORCID ID when you are applying for funding with NIH. Publishers also are requiring authors with ORCID IDs when they're submitting their manuscripts. So some examples here that we have Sage Publications, Springer Nature. So they are requiring ORCID IDs when you are submitting your when you're submitting your manuscript for publication, right? So, and this is just a way for you to also kind of making sure that your ORCID ID can be used to log in to the different systems, right? And here's an example of that. When you are logging in to say, to submit your article for review on Springing Nature, you can log in and use your ORCID ID. So you can make that connection. Their system is making that connection with ORCID. So that identifies you, making sure that it is the right person that's submitting it the information and the article in our system, and that's making that connection to your ORCID record. Research organizations are now also requiring ORCID ID. So we have institutions, higher ed institutions, that are now making sure that their researchers, even graduate students, have ORCID ID. A good example, for example, here, I believe is University of Southwestern Medical. Um, I can't get somehow I can't think of the full name, but it's the medical school in one of the University of Texas Southwestern, their medical school. They're basically requiring their graduate students to have an ORCID ID, and they make that connection in their system. So they've created a system, basically created an ORCID integration that connects to ORCID, of course, and then having their students log into that system and make the connection between their ORCID record and the university. And a big part of that is making sure that, that students and researchers are able to use ORCID, their publications are in there, and the university can also make the connection with the students over time. So they can they can grab reports, for example, on the activities of their researcher. And this is an example of that, an example of an ORCID integration from from the universities. So this is one is from Stanford University, where the researchers could go in, basically say either create an ORCID ID because I don't have one, or connect my existing ORCID ID because I already have one. So they can make that connection with the university or the institution. So ultimately, the idea here is saving time, right? For example, if as a researcher, or even if you're just if you're a graduate student right now, and eventually you're going to move on to do more research, do all of these things, right? As a researcher, you get to basically work at higher ed or a research institute or any other areas. So your employer, you can make sure that you're making that connection with your employer, and then when you're doing all of your research, you're going to apply for funding from the different agencies, from NIH, from American Heart Association. And then also after that, when you're doing all of your research, especially if it's funded, you're going to publish the work that you've created. So that's really sort of like the life, not a lot, the life cycle or the process of, a very simplified process of the research kind of work that you're doing. And all of these areas are able to make that connections with ORCID. We always like to think that it's really about saving time, partly because a big part of that is because you are entering the information once in your ORCID record, and then different systems. Your employer, for example, have a system. Your funder has a system that connects with ORCID, and your publishers have a system that connects to ORCID. They are able to make a connection to your ORCID record and be able to pull information from your ORCID record to fill out forms, for example. So to fill out a grant application, to fill out the publishing kind of information that they need when you're submitting manuscripts. So they're able to grab those. At the same time, it's also making sure that these organizations, your employer, the funder, the publishers, and any other organizations that are connected with ORCID, that if they have the capabilities of writing information in your ORCID record, that's even better because a publisher will write peer review activity, a funder will write funding information in your ORCID record, the employer will write the employment section of your ORCID record. So they're automatically feeding those information in your ORCID record, so you don't have to write them down. You don't have to enter them in the system. So a lot of those things are automatic in a way once systems are connected and interoperable with each other. So you can then reuse a lot of the information in your ORCID record to do different things, like I mentioned, grant applications, for example. So now that we kind of gone through the benefits, when you are thinking about ORCID in general, when you're going to say start applying for grants or start submitting for manuscripts, take a look at one of the things that kind of indicates that there's some sort of integration with that organization, with that system to ORCID, is that green ID button. If you see that, that's pretty much kind of signals that there's a way for you to make a connection with ORCID. So you can sign into a system using ORCID, for example. You can import data from from your ORCID record to fill forms and activities, and then you can also other systems are also able to send information to your ORCID record, to write information in your ORCID record. So you don't have to. For example, like a publisher will write peer review. They will also, through different kind of avenues, will write that publication, that citation in your ORCID record, so you don't have to. So that's really sort of like the interoperability, the connections that each systems are making to each other, to your ORCID record. All right, so I'm gonna pause there really quick. Do we have any question?
No, not from me. So far, everything's clear.
I don't have anything.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So, oh, Kevin, go ahead.
Hey, Paolo. Thank you for this. So, I don't know if you know, but how well do other sites, connect, like get that ORCID information? Because in my head, I think of like uploading a resume onto a website, and then you kind of get half the information there, and then kind of it's like, okay, I'm just gonna enter it again. So like,
Yeah.
how do you have any feedback on as far as how like other sites have you been using it, like government sites or?
Yeah. hmm Now I feel the pain, Kevin. I definitely hear you. When you're like uploading a CV, for example, and then you have to redo it pretty much everything. Now, it really depends on how the integration is being done. For example, if how many of you are familiar with Science CV? Um, like applying. So there's NIH, NSF grants, for example, and then you can apply for grants. You need to create a bio sketch, for example. So basically, information about yourself, information about the publications that you've done, all of those things, education. That's actually connected to ORCID. And that's a really good example because that particular system, when you're making that connection, the information is grabbed from your ORCID record, and then you can select and choose which publications to add to your to the bio sketch to fill out that entire information. Technically, you don't have to do anything because everything is transferred. Um, it's pretty good transfer actually. Um, but if you want to kind of fix some little things here and there, you can do that as well. But oftentimes, organizations have created their integration where the data is being grabbed and you don't really have to re-enter it again in their system. So, but ultimately, it all comes down to how organizations are making those kind of connections. Um, but I gotta say though, from based on my experience, it's definitely way better than uploading a CV and then you're gonna end up pretty much they're gonna ask you again to type all of those things, right? No, this has not been happening in that area. Um, but oftentimes they will probably ask you to like if you have say hundreds of publications already. Um, they will probably ask you pick and choose which publications you want to add to this application. That's what's going to happen. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
All right. So, to some of you that already have an ORCID ID, this is probably already kind of a recap for that. If you don't have an ORCID ID, this is just a quick kind of overview or workflow process of getting that ORCID ID. So first things first, you go to orcid.org/register. So remember, ORCID is free for you all. So you don't have to pay. Make sure you're not paying anything to create an ORCID ID. It is free. So you just go in there, orcid.org/register, enter your name and the email address. If you're using an institutional email address, it will probably tell you that this is a professional email, for example, and that's great. You definitely want to put that in there. You will have a primary email, and then you will also ask to do an additional email. Even though that's optional, I highly encourage that you add additional email addresses in there. So that way, if you move on to another organization, you move on to another institution, you can just easily use the other email, for example, to log in or to get that the credentials on your ORCID record. And then, of course, you set up your password, just follow that steps there. And then current employment, to affiliations. If you want to affiliate right away, you can do that here. And this is typically based on that email address. So if you're using Howard, for example, it will probably ask mention the current employment. You can enter that here. Now, even though that's kind of automatically done there, you can skip this step. You don't have to do this part of affiliation, but it's always a great idea to affiliate. If you're a student, you can affiliate that later on. But you see down the bottom, this says skip the step without adding an affiliation. Um, Keep in mind, one of the things that we always emphasize is that you as an ORCID user, as a researcher, is in control of your ORCID record. So you have the control to make connections with different organizations. You have the control on how you want your ORCID to be visible to the public. So talking about visibility is another step here. So it will ask you, everyone, which is basically how do you want your public record to be available? Everyone, it just means publicly available. You have trusted parties as an option, which just really means available to the organizations that you have given permissions to. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, how that trusted parties is. And then there's the option of only me, which is completely private, which, it doesn't make sense if you're going to make it completely private, your ORCID record, because no one's going to be able to see your information at all. Thank you for that, Ben. So yeah, definitely add additional email addresses, especially once you don't have access to your institutional email. All right. And then just, take a look at this, basically the terms and conditions, all of those things, and then you complete um, that registration. If somehow you forgot that you have an ORCID ID and then you sign up for one using the same email address, especially, it will tell you that this email already exists in the system. So, so there's a little bit of checks there. If you happen to create a second ORCID ID, we really want you to only use one ORCID ID. So you can always email support@orcid.org, and then we can deprecate the other ORCID ID. So that way you only have one. And then you can also log into ORCID depending on your institution. You can access it through your institution's credentials, for example. There's that option that says access through institution. It really depends on whether the organization is set up to do this. So you can try it if you like. So that's an option that you can do there. All right, any questions so far? Great, wonderful. Okay, so now let's go to, one of the most important things is populating your ORCID record. It's one thing to have an ORCID ID, but if you are not populating it, if you're leaving it blank, it's not going to be useful for you. So we want to make sure that you're populating your ORCID record. All right, so you can add information to your ORCID record. So things that you can add information to, of course, biographical information. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Employment, education and qualifications, professional activities, which is that invited positions, distinctions, memberships and service, funding, of course. And then you also have works, which are your publications. And finally, the other two down at the bottom that says peer review and research resources, those can only be written by organizations, by trusted organizations. So if you don't have that, if you don't have a peer review activity, if you have not used a research resources, those sections are not going to show up in your ORCID record. So just keep that in mind. The other thing also, and this is going to be for, like, say, when you are, in academia for a while now, doing more research, doing a lot of things, and you just can't keep up with your ORCID record. You can actually assign somebody else to be a trusted individual in your ORCID record. So they can not control, but they can make changes to your ORCID record. They can update your ORCID record, say, with new information that you want to add to that. So that's another way that people can use ORCID. So You just go through that trusted parties, then trusted individuals. You search for somebody's ORCID ID or name. The most important thing here is that that other person needs to have an ORCID ID as well. So I actually added my colleague here to be able to have the ability to update my ORCID record. All right, and then we talked about visibility settings earlier, which is basically for the entire thing. One thing to also note is that you can also control pretty much all sections of your ORCID record. It could be one entry. You can control the visibility setting of that. For example, employment. If you just don't, you only want to show certain positions or certain employment, you can do that by clicking on the kind of pencil icon here or the edit button, and then go to the section that you want to make changes to. So like say for here, for example, on the employment, the first one, I click on that visibility that says everyone, and then I can change the setting of that. So if I change it to only me, that's not going to show up publicly at all. So it's not going to be available. So that particular entry is not going to be available publicly. It's right there. And then we've talked a little bit about this already, about the different types of visibility settings. But most ORCID users use are almost 90% are have their ORCID record set publicly. So it's available for everyone to see. All right. So adding information to your ORCID record, you can do it by manual entry by you, of course. Your trusted individual can also do it manually in your ORCID record. You can also use search and link wizards, and then we'll talk more about that. And then you can also have trusted organizations automatically push information to your ORCID record. So manual entry, this is kind of a way for you to add information. If your organization are not pushing the information in your ORCID record, you can do this. You can go to your ORCID record, go to employment, add your employment information. So let's say I want to add, I work at University of Illinois, for example. I could search for University of Illinois, make sure that you are choosing and the option in that drop down kind of option or text. So making sure you click on that because that's important. So that way, the metadata behind it is available. And then you just fill out the rest of the form, like additional details of your employment. You can also do this for education. The same thing, the same kind of process, manually entering the education. So start, for example, typing in Howard University in your education when you're adding it manually, and then choose Howard University in the drop-down menu when you're doing this. And then fill out the rest of the information. Other manual entry examples is that you can add manually uninvited positions, qualifications, distinctions, memberships, and service. So you can add those information manually, as well as the biographical information of your ORCID record. Search and Link Wizard is another way where you could add information to your ORCID record. And this is used mainly in the work section and the funding section. Actually, those are the only two sections where you can do it from. So you go to your work section, click on add, for example, the add button, and then click on Search and Link Wizard. So Search and Link Wizards are sort of like systems that are already connected with ORCID. And this is a way for you to get to those systems easily. So here's an example of Crossref metadata search. Crossref is basically where a lot of the publishers pushes the citations of the publications. So the articles, for example. So click on Crossref metadata search. And then this is where that permission that you are giving to organizations is important, right? So you want to make sure that you're authorizing organizations such as Crossref to update information to your ORCID record. So this is where researchers have really full control of their ORCID record, because you could say that I don't want to give organization access to my ORCID record. That's fine. But to make it easier for you, you want to, you can basically make connections with trusted organizations. So here's an example where Crossref is asking that I want to add or update activities in your ORCID record. So the works, the publications, that sort of thing. And I also want to read information with the visibility set to trusted organizations only. So you make that authorization, and then you go to, it will take you to Crossref. You can search for your name, for example, to get the publications that you already have. So basically, you're kind of claiming the publication here. Search for your name, and then things will start popping up, the articles that you publish, that sort of thing. And then you will see the button that says add to ORCID. So that's a way for you, for the system to push that information to your ORCID record. And the same thing here as well. So that's what you do here. And now, once that added to your record or your system, the source of the data will say your name via Crossref metadata search. So that's a way for you to push information to your ORCID record. Now, if you have a lot of publications, right, you can also do sort of like a batch upload of all of those citations in ORCID. So essentially, you're adding it via a bibtex here. So let's say you have Google Scholar. You can actually export bibtex file out of Google Scholar of all of that citations and then upload it to ORCID. So that way you're not entering it manually one by one. And that's a way to do that. So just choose bibtex file to import and then export, basically add it to your ORCID record. All right. And in the funding section, there's also a search and link wizard. Here's an example of that, which is a dimensions wizard. You make that connection similar as what we did with Crossref metadata search. And then you could search for grants that you have received awards from in the system, and then have that push to your ORCID record. So now that you have those organizations, for example, you made a connection with Crossref, you made a connection with Dimensions Wizard. Let's say you applied for a grant application and you made a connection with American Heart Association. You're giving them permission. You've given, say, Springer Nature authorization to access your ORCID record. Once you make those authorization, they are what we are calling trusted parties or trusted organizations in your ORCID record. So you can actually see which organizations or which systems you have given permissions to in your ORCID record. So by going through the trusted parties section of your ORCID record, where your name is at, and then it will have a list of the different systems, just different organizations that you have given permissions to. Essentially here, when you give permission to researchers or to organizations, you've given them about 20 years worth of access to your ORCID record. So it's a really long kind of information, or really long kind of access, which is great, especially if you want to share information with your institutions, for example. So you have that 20 years. If you really, let's say, for example, you left an organization and you know what, and you're like, I don't really want to give that organization access to my ORCID record anymore, you can revoke the access. And you'll see that on the screenshot here that has revoke access. You can click on that. So that means that that particular organization no longer have access to your ORCID record once you do that revoke. Again, this is the idea of basically you're in full control of your ORCID record. All right. So once you've given trusted organizations access to your data and they're writing information to your ORCID record, they will become the source of that data, like DataCite, ORCID, for example, or Crossref metadata search. So those are things that you will see here. You will also see check marks in your ORCID record if an organization pushes that data to your ORCID record. And those check marks are what we are calling as trust markers in ORCID. So meaning the organization that you've given permissions to are the ones pushing that information in your ORCID record. So you'll see here an example of my ORCID record that says Lyrasis. So Lyrasis, my employer, push an information into my ORCID record, letting everyone know that I work for Lyrasis. So that's a trust marker. So there's a little bit more of trustworthiness to the information that's being pushed to ORCID. All right. So it's a lot of information, and I think this is most likely my last slide, actually. So one thing to remember is ORCID is that you're entering data once and then you can reuse that data often. Different systems, using it in publications, using it in funding, using it for your employers, for example. So really the idea here is that, or the one thing to kind of remember is that use your ORCID ID wherever possible. When you see that green ID icon, ORCID ID icon, there's a possibility that there's an ORCID integration there, and then use your ORCID ID. Use your ORCID record to grab those data, push the data to their system, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the big message here as well. All right, it's a lot of information. I think we have time, a little bit of time for question and answers. If we can't go through them today, you can always email me as well at orcidus@lyrasis.org if you have additional questions. But yeah, any questions right now? I'm gonna stop my sharing now, and then we can have a little bit of discussion.
This was great, Paolo. I do not have any personally don't have any questions, but the floor is open. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay.
All right, I guess not.
Thank
It's
you.
very
Thank you.
very clear. As I mentioned in the chat, those of you who want the recording, I'll be posting it to the YouTube channel for the Graduate Library Committee pretty soon. Yeah, this is great. Mr. Waters, you can go ahead and stop the recording. But yes, Paolo, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to ask everyone else who's joined us to just stay on for maybe a few minutes, and then we'll get into the final portion of our meeting today. Thank you again, Paolo.